Queen Elizabeth. Part 1. The Shadow of the Crown 1. In the chill of September 1533, under the vaulted ceilings of Greenwich Palace, a baby girl's first cry shattered the silence. Her name was Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. But her birth, instead of joy, brought disappointment to a kingdom craving a son. 2. Henry VIII had risked his crown, defied the Pope, and torn his country from Rome to marry Anne. Yet the child born of his defiance was not the male heir he had promised himself, but a girl with flame-colored hair and sharp, unyielding eyes. 3. Courtiers whispered that the king looked away when he first saw her. They said Anne smiled too brightly, trying to hide her fear. The air in the royal court was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of unmet expectations. 4. Elizabeth's cradle was lined with silk, but her fate was woven with thorns. For in Tudor England, a woman's worth was measured in the sons she could bear. 5. Within 3 short years, her world would crumble. Anne Boleyn, her mother, accused of adultery and treason, stood upon the scaffold at the Tower of London, her final words trembling in the cold morning air. 6. Elizabeth was not there to see the blade fall. Yet she would carry the echo of that moment all her life, a reminder that even queens could bleed, and crowns could turn to chains. 7. Declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, she was cast out from the line of succession. The daughter of the disgraced queen became an orphan of politics. 8. Yet even in exile, the young Elizabeth absorbed knowledge like a flame feeds on air. Tudors were astonished at her wit, her memory, and her insatiable curiosity. 9. She mastered languages, Latin, Greek, Italian, and French, long before most noblemen could read their own laws. Her mind was her armor, and she learned early that words could protect where swords could not. 10. As she grew, her father remarried again and again, each wife bringing a different danger or lesson. Henry VIII's court was a place of whispers, betrayals, and sudden deaths, a chessboard drenched in blood. 11. Elizabeth learned to play her part. She smiled when watched, stayed silent when questioned, and listened always. Survival became her art. Junie, when Henry finally died in 1547, Elizabeth was 13. Her half-brother Edward VI ascended the throne, a boy king molded by Protestant zeal and cold advisors. 13. Elizabeth's position was precarious but hopeful. As the king's sister, she was royal enough to matter, but distant enough not to threaten. 14. Yet peace was fleeting. When Edward's health began to fail, the question of succession returned to haunt England like a ghost unwilling to rest. Jugo Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, rose and fell within a fortnight, and soon Mary, Henry's eldest daughter and a devout Catholic, claimed the throne. 16. For Elizabeth, this was a perilous turn. She was Protestant, a symbol to all who opposed Mary's reign. 17. The two sisters met with uneasy courtesy, each recognizing the other's potential as both family and threat. Behind their smiles were prayers for survival. 18. Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain deepened England's division. Catholic fervor swept through the land like wildfire, burning heretics and silencing dissent. This and Webbe, Elizabeth was summoned to court, accused of conspiracy in Wyatt's rebellion, a plot she swore she knew nothing of. 20. Yet her denials fell on deaf ears. Soldiers came to escort her, not to safety, but to the Tower of London, the same place where her mother had met her end. 21. The river was black that day, and as her barge drifted beneath the Traitor's Gate, Elizabeth crossed herself. I am innocent, she whispered to the stones. 22. Within those cold walls, she waited day after day, night after night, as rumors spread that she would soon follow her mother to the scaffold. Need you some but fate, ever unpredictable, spared her. Mary's advisors could not prove her guilt, and public sympathy for the young princess grew too strong to ignore. 24. When she was finally released, Elizabeth emerged pale and trembling, but alive. Her imprisonment had marked her, carved resolve into her soul. 25. From that day forward, she trusted no one completely. Not advisors, not suitors, not even the crown itself. 26. She returned to her quiet estate at Hatfield, where she lived in studied humility. Yet behind her modesty, she planned, learned, and waited. Niju Nunna, the child who had been unwanted, was now the only tutor with both strength and intelligence enough to rule. 28. As Mary's reign grew darker, executions, famine, rebellion, England began to whisper another name, Elizabeth. 29. Letters arrived from nobles and reformers, all pleading for her to lead them into a new dawn. 30. She answered, none of them. Silence was her greatest weapon. 31. Then, in 1558, death came for Queen Mary. The bells that tolled for her also rang for England's rebirth. Sunjuni Elizabeth, at 25, received word of her sister's passing while walking in the gardens of Hatfield. She sank to her knees, eyes lifted to the gray winter sky, and murmured, "It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." 33. But beneath her reverence burned a fire, a promise that her reign would not mirror the cruelty she had endured. 34. Within days, nobles and messengers flooded Hatfield, kneeling before her as their new queen. 35. The coronation was set for January 1559, and England, weary of religious war, looked upon Elizabeth as its last hope for peace. Sanju Roka, yet Elizabeth understood what they did not. Crowns were heavy things, and peace came at a price. 37. Her first act was one of calculated brilliance. She restored the Protestant faith, yet did not persecute Catholics openly. 38. I have no desire to make windows into men's souls, she declared, a statement that would define her rule. 39. Her council, however, was divided. Some saw her as too soft, others too shrewd. 40. Foreign ambassadors called her the maiden fox, a queen whose beauty concealed the mind of a general. Yeonjui suitors came from across Europe, princes, dukes, and kings. Yet Elizabeth remained unmarried, her heart and throne guarded alike. 42. For she had seen what marriage had done to her mother. Love turned to ruin, vows into execution. 43. So she wore chastity as her armor and independence as her crown. 44. The people adored her, calling her Good Queen Bess. 45. But adoration was fleeting, and power always precarious. 46. Even as she smiled for her subjects, Elizabeth knew the daggers of ambition were never far. 47. Plots brewed in the shadows, some foreign, some born of English soil. 48, yet she faced them all with unshakable grace, her calm composure unnerving even her enemies. 49. In private, she wrote poetry, words laced with longing and loneliness. I am, and am not, one line read, torn between the world and my own soul. 50. Those who served her closely spoke of her sharp wit and colder temper. She could charm or crush with a glance. 51. But her brilliance was undeniable. Every law, every alliance, every gesture of mercy was a move in a greater game, survival. 52. When her council warned her of Spain's disapproval, she laughed lightly. Let them disapprove, she said, so long as England stands. 53. Behind her laughter was a memory, the cries of her mother, the chill of the tower, the taste of fear. 54. She vowed that no one would ever control her fate again. 55. Thus began the careful construction of Elizabeth's legend, a queen untouched, untamed, and utterly sovereign. 56. Pain had forged her will. Isolation had sharpened her instincts. 57. Even her wardrobe became part of her politics' gold-threaded gowns, jeweled collars, and towering ruffs that made her seem divine. 58. The queen is married to her people, said her advisers, and in time, even she believed it. 59. Her portraits radiated power, her speeches stirred loyalty, and her enemies began to fear her restraint more than her wrath. 60. Yet in the stillness of night, Elizabeth sometimes stood before her mirror and wondered if the girl named after a mother's disgrace had truly escaped her shadow. 61. England's destiny now rested in her hands. Every decision could save or doom a nation. 62. The bishops pressed her to marry. The nobles begged for heirs. 63. But Elizabeth only smiled, saying, "I shall have but one mistress here, and no master." 64. Her words sent ripples through Europe, both admiration and alarm. 65. A woman ruling alone was unheard of, an act of defiance against tradition, church, and man. 66. Yet she relished the challenge, turning her solitude into spectacle. 67. The court became her stage, and every gesture, every glance, a calculated performance. 68. She rewarded loyalty, punished deceit, and remembered every 69. The courtiers soon learned the queen's favor was as dangerous as her anger. 70. But Elizabeth's reign was not built on cruelty. It was built on control. 71. She gave her people hope, and in return, demanded devotion. 72. "We are one body," she proclaimed. "What touches you, touches me." 73. It was both truth and illusion, for she had learned that to be loved was to be vulnerable. 74. The girl who had once feared the tower now ruled from its heights. 75. The empire she inherited was fragile, but her vision was clear: to unite, to endure, to shine. 76. The fire of her youth had not dimmed, it had only refined. 77. Elizabeth was not her father's heir, nor her mother's echo. She was something new, forged from both, yet beholden to neither. 78. Her story was no longer one of survival. It was one of destiny. 79. But destiny has its price. 80. As the crown gleamed upon her head and cheers rose across London, she could almost hear the whisper of her mother's voice carried by the wind. 81. Remember, daughter? It seemed to say. The higher you rise, the sharper the blade. 82. Elizabeth turned from the window, her expression unreadable. 83. The court celebrated below, the city drunk with hope. 84. But the new queen knew peace was never permanent, and power always demanded sacrifice. 85. The golden age England dreamed of had just begun, but so too had the storm. 86. Beyond the seas, enemies within her borders, loyalties trembled. 87. And somewhere deep within her heart, the child once rejected by her father prepared to prove her worth to the world. 88. The shadow of the crown had shaped her. Now it would define her reign. 89. Thus began the legend of Elizabeth the Virgin Queen. 90. And as dawn broke over London, its rays glinted off her crown, illuminating a monarch, born not of privilege, but of perseverance and fire. Queen Elizabeth I, Part 2. The storm before the throne won. The coronation of Elizabeth I had filled England with hope, but beneath the gold and pageantry lay a kingdom divided by faith and memory. The wounds of her father's reformation and her sister's persecutions still bled in silence. 2. Catholics mourned their lost altars. Protestants demanded deeper reform, and nobles shifted allegiances like waves chasing the tide. Elizabeth stood at the center of it all, radiant, yet alone. 3. The first test of her reign came swiftly. Foreign ambassadors watched her closely, reporting back to Rome, to Spain, and to France, each curious whether this young queen could hold the fragile crown she wore. 4. To them, she was a woman, and a woman was weakness. But to Elizabeth, their doubt was fuel. She would rule not as a wife or daughter, but as England itself. 5. Her council gathered, cautious men, seasoned by war and betrayal. Foremost among them was William Cecil, first Baron Burleigh, sharp, loyal, and utterly devoted. He became the spine of her government, her watchful shadow. 6. Cecil warned her that the greatest threat was not rebellion, but religion. England's faith, like its queen, stood on a knife's edge. 7. In her first parliament, Elizabeth restored the Protestant settlement, a delicate balance between tradition and reform. The Bible returned in English, but the crucifix remained. 8. She walked a narrow line between two worlds, refusing to let Etha claim her completely. Her moderation enraged zealots and confounded enemies. 9. She hath the heart of a man, one ambassador wrote, and the cunning of a woman. Jew yet even, as she strengthened her realm, marriage loomed over every conversation. Without an heir, her throne was fragile, her future uncertain. 11. The suitors came in glittering procession. Philip II of Spain, widower of her sister. Archduke Charles II of Austria of the Habsburg line. And Eric, the 14th of Sweden, mad with desire for a woman he'd never met. 12. Each offer came wrapped in treaties and promises, each a golden cage. Elizabeth smiled at them all and accepted none. Jew some I am already bound unto a husband, she told Parliament, her voice ringing through Westminster Hall. The Kingdom of England is my spouse. 14. The declaration sent shockwaves through Europe. The Virgin Queen had been born in that moment, an idea as much as a ruler, untouchable, unclaimed. 15. But her unmarried state was not without danger. Ambitious men sought to influence her heart, hoping power might come through love. 16. Among them was Robert Dudley, 1st Earl of Leicester, her childhood companion, handsome, bold, and daringly close to the Queen's favor. June Nana whispers filled the court, murmurs that Elizabeth and Dudley shared more than friendship. Their closeness was both her comfort and her peril. 80. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the foot of a staircase, scandal erupted like fire. The cause was uncertain, but tongues wagged of murder and ambition. 19. Elizabeth's enemies seized the chance to stain her name. The Queen would wed her lover, they whispered, even if it be upon his wife's grave. Need you! Yet Elizabeth, though shaken, did not falter. She distanced herself publicly, grieving in silence while keeping Dudley at her side in shadow. 21. Her restraint saved her throne. She knew that one false move, one tear too many, could destroy her. 22. In this, she proved her mastery of image. Elizabeth did not merely rule. She performed power, crafting her every gesture into legend. 23. Her portraits showed her ageless, her gaze steady and serene. The crown glittered above her, as if light itself obeyed her command. Niju Yon, her motto, Semper Idem, always the same, became her creed. To the world, she was unchanging, immortal, untouchable. 25. But within her, storms raged. Nights of doubt gnawed at her resolve. The ghosts of her mother and sister haunted her silence. 26. Yet dawn always found her steady once more, her mask of serenity restored. England could not afford her weakness. 27. Meanwhile, beyond the seas, the great powers conspired. France held Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and rival, claim to the English throne. Niju Hachimari was everything Elizabeth was not. Openly Catholic, beautiful, and already widowed young to Catholics in England. She was the rightful queen. 29. Elizabeth tread carefully, sending envoys wrapped in charm and threat alike. She knew Mary's existence was a spark that could ignite her entire realm. 30. Keep her near, but never close, Cecil advised. The nearer the flame, the faster the wax melts. 31. As Mary returned to rule Scotland, tension between them grew inevitable. 2 queens, 2 faiths, 1 destiny. Sanju ni, yet for a time, they exchanged letters, polite, even affectionate. My dearest sister, one began, though neither trusted the other. 33. Beneath the ink, each plotted her own survival. 34. Elizabeth's Trade expanded, poetry flourished, and explorers set sail for the edges of the known world. 35! The Queen encouraged it all, understanding that glory abroad would unite a divided nation. 36! She backed Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, men whose courage carried the English flag across oceans. Sanju Nana, each ship that returned laden with treasure, also brought something far greater: pride. 38! Elizabeth's rule became a golden mirror in which her people saw their own strength. 39. But as the light of her empire grew, so too did the shadows beneath it. 40. Spain's Philip, II of Spain, watched with fury. He had once courted Elizabeth. Now she was his greatest enemy, a Protestant queen defying Catholic Europe. 41. His fleets loomed over the horizon, his spies whispering through English courts. Cuarentaidos! Elizabeth responded, with diplomacy sharper than any sword. She danced between alliances, promising everything and yielding nothing. 43. Time, she said once, brings all things to pass, and I mean to outlive my troubles. 44. Her patience was legendary. Where others acted, she waited. Where others raged, she smiled. 45. Even her enemies admitted her brilliance. She is a woman who does not sleep, wrote one ambassador. She waits and watches and wins. 46. But her vigilance came at a cost. The loneliness of power weighed upon her. 47. Dudley remained near, loyal but impossible. Love, for Elizabeth, was a luxury she could never afford. 48. She called him my eyes, but she never let him see her heart. 49. As years passed, her youth faded, but her authority deepened. The court began to worship her as a symbol, part woman, part myth. 50. Poets called her Gloriana. Painters adorned her in celestial light, and subjects bowed as if before a goddess. 51. Yet behind that radiance, Elizabeth understood the fragility of her kingdom. Rebellion simmered in Ireland, and Mary of Scots' shadow grew darker. 52 papal agents plotted her death. Assassins crossed the channel in disguise. 53. One such plot, the Rodolphi conspiracy, nearly succeeded. It sought to replace Elizabeth with Mary and restore Catholic rule. 54. Cecil uncovered it before it could bloom, and Elizabeth's vengeance was swift. 55. Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, England's highest noble, was executed. The message was clear. Even bloodlines could not protect treason. 56. Still, Elizabeth hesitated to strike Mary. To execute a queen was to unmake the sanctity of monarchy itself. 57. But each day, Mary lived. Danger grew. Goju Hachi. Elizabeth turned to her council, weary yet resolute. Better one death, she murmured, than 1,000 undone by her cause. 59. Still, she delayed, her conscience torn between justice and necessity. 60. Across Europe, pamphlets painted her as a heretic, a witch, a woman unfit to rule. 61. But England saw her differently, not as a witch, but as a miracle. 62. She became the embodiment of national pride, the guardian of English soul. 63. Every victory, every law, every festival was tied to her name. 64. God Save the Queen became not a prayer, but a promise. Look at you go. Yet Elizabeth knew what her people did not, that her throne rested upon faith as fragile as glass. 66. Enemies abroad, conspirators within, and a future uncertain, without an heir. 67. Still, she stood undaunted. I will have one mistress here, she said again, and no master. 68. It was both defiance and destiny. 69. The Virgin Queen had become more than a ruler. She was an idea, England itself, clothed in silk and courage. 70. She had survived disgrace, imprisonment, and betrayal. Now she must survive history's greatest trial, the test of legacy. 71. For as her enemies gathered across the sea, destiny prepared to test the steel of her crown. 72. Clouds gathered over Europe. The whispers of war thickened the air. 73. Philip of Spain began to build an armada, a fleet vast enough to crush England in one storm. 74. And as he did, Elizabeth waited once more, silent and unyielding, her gaze fixed beyond the horizon. 75. Her counselors urged her to marry, to seek alliance. 76. But she smiled that same secret, knowing smile that had outlasted every storm. 77. If I am to be destroyed, she said softly, it shall not be by the hands of a husband, but by the will of God. 78. The court fell silent, awed, and fearful. 79. Even Cecil, the man who knew her best, saw then that Elizabeth was no longer just a monarch. She was a legend forming in real time. 80. Yet legends are lonely things. 81. In the stillness of her chamber, she often walked alone, her fingers tracing the jeweled cross at her throat. 82. She prayed not for love, nor for peace, but for endurance. 83. And in those whispered prayers, she found her answer. 84. I will endure, she murmured, for England must endure through me. 85. That night, as candles flickered across Whitehall, the Queen slept beneath the weight of an empire's hope. 86. Beyond her dreams, storm clouds gathered, the Spanish threats now real and rising. 87. The tide of history was turning, and England's fate would soon be written in fire and salt water. 88. But for now, Elizabeth dreamed of sunlight and peace, fragile illusions she knew would not last. 89. The path to power was complete, but the path to survival had only begun. Cue as dawn broke over London, the bells tolled once more, not in fear, but in faith. Faith in the woman who had turned her own scars into a crown. Queen Elizabethan, Ipato, i.e., the golden throne, rise of the Virgin Queen. 1. The dawn of Elizabeth's third decade upon the throne painted England in gold. What began as a kingdom uncertain of its queen had become a nation united by her legend. 2. Artists, poets, and sailors all spoke her name as if it were a prayer. The Virgin Queen, untouched, unbroken, eternal. 3. Yet behind the poetry was purpose. Elizabeth understood the theater of power better than any monarch before her. 4. Her throne was not merely a seat of rule, it was a stage, and she its greatest performer. 5. She crafted her image with divine precision. The white face paint, the crimson lips, the towering ruffs, all symbols of authority and immortality. 6. To see her was to see England itself, radiant, fierce, and holy. 7. Her portraits became propaganda. Her words became scripture. Painters were instructed never to show her age, never to betray fatigue or sorrow. 8. The image of Gloriana, eternal and untouchable, was born not in truth but in brilliance. 9. Even her court began to mirror her magnificence. The Palace of Whitehall pulsed with music, dance, and poetry. 10. Men like Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare began to lace her legend into the fabric of English identity. 11. The world beyond England's shores, however, was far from serene. Spain's shadow grew darker each year, its Catholic might threatening to drown the Protestant Isle. 12. Philip II's rage burned like oil. The heretic queen had defied Rome and humiliated his empire. Jusan, his priests, called her the Jezebel of the North. His admirals began to sharpen their anchors. 14. Elizabeth's spies, led by the brilliant Francis Walsingham, intercepted whispers of invasion. 15. They uncovered letters, plots, and poison, all flowing from one name that haunted Elizabeth's dreams: Mary, Queen of Scots. 16. Mary had become a living weapon in Philip's plans. A queen in exile, Catholic by blood, a martyr in waiting. 17. In 1586, Walsingham intercepted the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary upon the throne. Juhachi! The evidence was clear. The crime unforgivable. And yet, Elizabeth hesitated. 19. To sign Mary's death warrant was to spill royal blood, to kill her own cousin. 20. 4 weeks she paced her chambers, torn between duty and conscience. 21. Her counselors pressed her, if you spare her, you doom yourself. 22. At last, Elizabeth's trembling hand signed the warrant, and history shifted. 23. When Mary was executed at Fotheringay Castle, witnesses said she met death with the calm of a saint. Niju Yong, her lips moved in prayer, her blood spilled on the block, and with it, Elizabeth's peace. 25. The Queen wept alone that night. She called it the bitterest day of my life. 26. But remorse could not stop the tide of consequence. Across Europe, Mary's death became a rallying cry. 27. Philip II swore vengeance. Now, he said, God shall punish England through my hand. 28. He began assembling the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, the Spanish Armada. Niju Q in secret harbors. Shipwrights built galleons the size of cathedrals. Cannons gleamed. Banners were blessed. 30. The Pope himself offered his blessing for the holy war to come. 31. England braced itself for annihilation. 32. Elizabeth, though surrounded by fear, refused to hide. She rode among her soldiers in armor, her voice ringing above the clamor. 33. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, she declared, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England too. 34. The words became legend, echoing through centuries. 35. Her courage lit the hearts of every man who heard her. 36. When the Armada sailed in 1588, 130 ships strong, the sea itself seemed to tremble. 37. But the English had something the Spanish did not: speed, cunning, and the wind. 38. Fire ships, sent blazing into the night, scattered the enemy fleet like frightened ghosts. 39. The winds turned traitor against Spain. The Protestant wind, they called it. 40. When dawn rose, the Armada lay shattered upon the rocks of Ireland and Scotland. 41. England rejoiced, and Elizabeth's name was immortalized. 42. Painters captured her in triumph, standing over a globe, her hand upon the Atlantic. 43. In her victory, she became more than mortal. She became myth. 44. Even her enemies could not deny her genius. She governs with her head, wrote one ambassador, and never with her heart. 45. Yet inside the palace, the heart still beat lonely and proud. 46. Robert Dudley, her beloved companion, had died in 1588, the same year as her greatest triumph. 47, his last letter, found in her chambers after her death, was labeled his last letter. She had kept it until her final breath. 48! With Dudley gone, she buried the last ember of her youth. 49. The Virgin Queen withdrew from the dances, from the laughter, from the touch of human warmth. 50! She poured herself entirely into the state. Her people became her children, her court her family. 51. Poets compared her to Estrella, the goddess of justice, who fled the earth when men became corrupt. 52! She has returned, they wrote, in the form of our queen. 53. Her reign ushered in an age of unparalleled creativity. The Elizabethan era became a synonym for glory. 54. Theaters filled London's streets, and new voices sang of kings, lovers, and ghosts. 55. Shakespeare's plays captured her image, fierce, wise, eternal. 56. England's sailors continued to conquer the seas. Drake circled the globe. Raleigh named a new land, Virginia, in her honor. 57. The world was beginning to change, and England stood at its helm. 58. Elizabeth's genius lay not just in survival but in transformation. She had turned vulnerability into vision. 59. Her femininity became her weapon. Her solitude became her strength. 60. Foreign rulers, who once mocked her as the heretic whore, now bowed before her diplomacy. 61. She played kings like chess pieces, her patience outlasting their tempers. 62. The Queen of England was now the Queen of Europe's game. 63. But time, ever her rival, began its silent work. The face that had once entranced nations began to fade behind layers of pearl and paint. Look at you, Young! Courtiers noticed her moods growing darker, her eyes colder. 65. Her Majesty fears no man, one noted, but she cannot command her own years. 66. The court whispered of melancholy, of sleepless nights, and endless reflection. 67. She began to walk the palace halls at night, clutching Dudley's letter as if it still whispered comfort. 68. Her counselors urged her to rest, to name a successor. 69. But Elizabeth refused. A crown is not a thing to be shared, she said. I shall not part with mine while breath remains. 70. To her, to name an heir was to invite her own death. 71. Yet even in her twilight, her brilliance did not fade. 72. Ambassadors still trembled before her gaze. Poets still praised her as divine. 73. Her power was no longer political. It was symbolic, spiritual, eternal. 74. She had become England's mirror, its conscience, its myth. 75. And though she aged, her people saw only the golden image she had created. 76. Our Gloriana lives forever, they said, even as her steps slowed and her laughter dimmed. 94. Elizabeth had achieved what no monarch before her could. She had become an idea. 78. Not merely a queen of men, but of time itself. 79. Yet within her heart, the woman still lived. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, the child once abandoned, now immortalized. 80. Her life had been a war between survival and emotion, and survival had won. 81. But victory carries its own loneliness. 82. On winter nights, when the candles burned low, Elizabeth would whisper to the empty air, all my possessions for one moment of peace. Hachiju sung peace, however, was never meant for her. 84. For Elizabeth I was not born for rest. She was born to reign, to define, to endure. 85. As the world turned its gaze toward England, she stood at its center, defiant against the inevitable dusk. 86. Her reign, like the sun, would one day set, but even the setting sun leaves the world in gold. 87. And so, the Elizabethan age burned brighter than any before it, a golden blaze that defied the coming dark. 88. Her enemies destroyed, her people adoring, her name eternal, yet her soul ever alone. 89. To be a legend, she had learned, was to live without rest and to rule without love. 90. But in the silence of her solitude, England itself breathed through her, and that, above all, was enough. Queen Elizabeth I, Part 4, Enemies Within, Betrayal, Plots, and Bloodlines. 1. As the 1590s dawned, the golden light of Elizabeth's reign began to flicker. The queen who had defied empires now faced enemies not abroad, but within her own court. 3. The courtiers who had once worshipped their radiant monarch now whispered in corridors, hungry for favor, fearful of her wrath. 4. Time had changed Elizabeth. Her patience thinned, her heart armored against betrayal. 5. The queen who once inspired devotion now demanded obedience. 6. Among her most trusted and most dangerous was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. 7. Young, daring, and handsome. Essex had charmed his way into Elizabeth's inner circle. 8. He reminded her of the beloved Robert Dudley, bold, reckless, and intoxicatingly alive. 9. But unlike Dudley, Essex lacked restraint. His pride burned brighter than his loyalty. The Queen favored him, gifted him command, even forgave his insolence, until ambition drove him too far. 12. Elizabeth's fury was volcanic. No man, not even a favorite, could invade the sanctity of her authority. 13. She struck him, and he turned away in humiliation, his pride shattered before the court. Yawned. The rift between them grew into rebellion. Essex began to conspire with discontented nobles, dreaming of removing her advisors, and perhaps even her crown. 15. In 1601, his reckless plan erupted into the open. The Essex Rebellion. 16. With a band of followers, he marched through London, shouting that the Queen was misled by traitors. 17. But the people did not rise. The rebellion crumbled within hours. 18. Essex was captured, tried, and condemned. Diasin Webe on the morning of his execution. Elizabeth hesitated, just as she had with Mary. Queen of Scots. 20. She remembered his laughter, his arrogance, the spark that once reminded her of her youth. 21. But mercy was a luxury she could no longer afford. 22. He has lifted his hand against his sovereign, she whispered, and the hand that rises must fall. 23. Essex was beheaded at the Tower of London, the last favorite to test the Virgin Queen's patience. Young, yet his death left a hollow space in her soul that no triumph could fill. 25. The court grew colder, the laughter fainter. Elizabeth withdrew behind layers of paint and ceremony. 26. The once radiant queen now appeared spectral white as alabaster, eyes shadowed by memory. 27. The mask she had worn for decades began to weigh upon her spirit. 28. She does not eat. She does not sleep, wrote a courtier. She merely endures. Niju outside the palace walls, England prospered. The seeds of empire had been planted. 30. But within the walls of Richmond Palace, the queen who had made England immortal was fading. 31. Her counselors urged her to name a successor, but she refused to surrender the only identity she had ever known. 32. To name an heir, she said, is to dig my grave. 33. Yet time pressed upon her like a silent executioner. 34. The question of succession grew louder, and with it, her isolation. 35. Only one man remained close enough to speak truth. Sorrow Beruseshiru, son of her late advisor, William Cecil. 36. Pragmatic and shrewd, Cecil sought to preserve stability beyond her reign. 37. Secretly, he began correspondence with James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. 38. Elizabeth knew, perhaps, but chose silence. 39. It was her unspoken act of mercy to allow the bloodline she had extinguished to return in peace. Yonjua thoughts turned often to her mother and Bullen, another queen destroyed by ambition and politics. 41. My mother was slain for love and power, she once murmured. I have survived by denying both. 42. The irony was cruel. She had sacrificed her humanity for the sake of England. 43. The courtiers called her immortal, but she was, at last, only mortal. 44. Illness crept upon her slowly, not a single blow, but the steady exhaustion of years. Yeonju go! Her beloved friends were gone, her counselors dead or dying. 46. The music of her youth had faded into whispers of prayer and regret. 47. She began spending long hours seated upon cushions on the floor, refusing to take her bed. 48. Little by little, wrote her physician, she turns from the world she ruled. 49. The woman who had stood before armies now trembled at shadows. 50. Yet, even in decline, her pride remained fierce. 51. When her attendants begged her to rest, she snapped, Must I be shown how to die? 52! Her words were sharp, but beneath them was sorrow. 53. She had outlived her generation, her rivals, her loves, her enemies. 54. Only the crown remained, gleaming coldly in its case, the last companion of her reign. 55. Visitors described her as ghostly, her mind drifting between prayer and silence. 56. The once dazzling queen now wore only black, her jewels locked away. 57. She mourns not the dead, one servant said, but herself. 58. In her dreams, she saw her mother's eyes, her father's throne, and the river Thames reflecting her youth. 59. She whispered to herself, was it all worth it? 60. Yet history would answer her, yes. 61. For England, under Elizabeth, had become an empire of thought and vision, a kingdom that would echo through the centuries. 62. Her image, carefully sculpted through decades of rule, would never fade. Lokajusang artists immortalize her as Gloriana Astrea, the goddess, returned. 64. But those who stood at her bedside knew a different truth. The frail body behind the legend. 65. On cold spring nights, she asked her maids to read her favorite psalms. 66. Remember, not my sins, she would whisper, but my service. 67. Her lips trembled with every word, but her voice carried the same authority that once commanded armies. 68. She still refused to name James as heir aloud, but Cecil's plan was in motion. 69. The future was already taking shape beyond her shadow. 70. She, who had shaped the world, now surrendered to time. 71. But death, like any adversary, would find her prepared. 72. The queen fears not death, said her chaplain, but the forgetting of her glory. 73. Yet forgetting was impossible. Her reign had written itself into the soul of England. 74. The poets called her reign the dawn of light after an age of shadows. None as you go! Her enemies called her witch, her subjects called her mother, her allies called her miracle. 76. In truth, she was all saint, sinner, sovereign. 77. Her triumph was not perfection, but in 78. For nearly half a century, she had ruled without a husband, without a child, without a rival. 79. And in that solitude, she had found immortality. 80. As winter deepened, her attendants wrapped her in furs, but she felt no warmth. 81. She stared at the flickering fire and whispered, I am tired. Hachijuni. When they asked what troubled her, she simply said, my sun is setting. 83. And indeed, it was the golden light that had illuminated an age now faded into dusk. 84. The courtiers who once trembled before her now wept silently in the halls. 85. The queen who feared no man, one wrote, has become gentler than a child. 86. But even in that softness, her power remained quiet, immense, and eternal. 87. Her last words, it is said, were whispered to no one. All my possessions for one moment of time. 88 tang! Her greatest servant, her final master. 89. As the candlelight dimmed, England held its breath. 90. For the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor, the woman who turned fragility into empire, was preparing to meet her eternity. The years weighed heavily upon Elizabeth. Once the radiant Gloriana, whose fiery speeches and keen mind commanded a kingdom, she now walked through the silent halls of her palaces like a ghost trapped in her own legend. Her courtiers still bowed low, but she could feel the truth time was stealing the lights from her eyes. The strength from her voice, and the friends who once filled her court with laughter, had faded into graves and memories. She would often sit before the mirror, staring at the face that no longer reflected England's eternal youth. Her crimson wigs and white-powdered face could not hide the withering truth. Her body was failing, her spirit tired. Yet, the fire that had carried her through wars, betrayals, and heartbreak refused to die quietly. Robert Dudley, her lifelong companion, had died years ago. She had never recovered. In private, she still called him my eyes. His last letter remained locked beside her bed, and she would touch it on sleepless nights. Her most trusted counselors were gone Walsingham. Cecil, the old lions of her court, were buried beneath the stones of Westminster. New faces surrounded her now, but they were strangers, servants of a world she had created but no longer recognized. England, under her reign, had become a power feared across Europe. The Armada was a story now told by father's two sons, a tale of divine victory. But victory brought new pressurizing debt, unrest in Ireland, ambitions abroad. The Queen, ever proud, could no longer ride among her people as she once did. Her court began to whisper. The Queen was failing. The sun of England was setting. In her private chambers, Elizabeth's melancholy deepened. She refused food, refused sleep. 4 hours she would stand motionless, her mind drifting through memories, her coronation, her first speech to Parliament, her triumph over Spain, her youth with Robert, her sister's cruelty, her father's ghost. Each memory was both a crown and a chain. She once said, "I would rather be a beggar and single than a queen and married." But now, as death drew near, she wondered if she had been wrong to choose a kingdom over love. Her attendants watched helplessly as her strength ebbed away. When they tried to move her to her bed, she refused, whispering, "Must is a word not to be used to princes." She lay upon the cushions on the floor, her body frail yet her will unbroken. The courtiers dared not speak, for the silence in the palace was sacred. Every breath could be her last. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, visions haunted her. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, smiling through the mist. Her father, Henry VIII, watching from the shadows, the faces of those she had condemned in the name of survival. She whispered to them all, half in sorrow, half in defiance. She had outlived them all, but at what cost? Finally, she named her successor James VI of Scotland, son of her cousin Mary, the woman she had executed. The irony was bitter and poetic, but Elizabeth accepted it. England would have peace, even if it meant her dynasty's bloodline had come full circle. In the early hours of March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth breathed her last at Richmond Palace. No final words, only the stillness of a queen who had carried an empire upon her shoulders. The courtiers wept in silence. Some knelt beside her, whispering prayers. Others simply watched, awestruck, realizing that they had witnessed the end of an era. Her body was carried to Westminster Abbey through streets lined with thousands of mourners. They did not cheer, they wept. Even those who had once plotted against her now bowed their heads. The Virgin Queen, who had never married, had wed herself to her country and, in death, she belonged to it forever. The bells of London tolled for hours, their echo rolling over the Thames like a lament. The crown she had worn so fiercely passed to a new monarch, but none would ever rule with her blend of intellect, iron, and mystique. The Elizabethan age, the era of Shakespeare, of exploration, of art and firehead, ended with her final breath. And yet, even centuries later, her spirit lingers. In portraits, her eyes still burn with defiance. In the hearts of a people, she remains eternal, a woman who defied her father's legacy, her enemies, and time itself. Her words echo across history. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. Her life was a crown forged from pain, and her death a torch that lit the path for all who would come after her. The Virgin Queen was gone, but the empire she shaped, the legend she became, still whispered across the centuries.